You think you know someone after 23 years of marriage. You think you've learned every story, heard every anecdote, mapped every corner of their past. You build a life together on the foundation of shared history and trust, believing that you've seen all there is to see. But sometimes, you're wrong. Sometimes, the person sleeping next to you every night is a stranger in ways you never imagined. I discovered this truth on a humid Saturday morning in July, while doing something as mundane as cleaning out our basement. My husband David had been gone for 6 months, taken by cancer that moved through his body with devastating speed. The grief was still fresh, still catching me off guard at random moments throughout the day. But life goes on, as everyone keeps telling you it does, and eventually you have to face the practical realities of loss. The house was too full of his things, and my sister had gently suggested that maybe it was time to start sorting through them. The basement had always been David's territory. Over the years, it had become a repository for everything we didn't need in our daily lives but couldn't quite bring ourselves to throw away. Old furniture, holiday decorations, boxes of books we'd read once and might read again someday, tools David had collected for projects he swore he'd get around to eventually. I'd been avoiding it, knowing that going through his things would make his absence feel even more permanent. That morning, armed with garbage bags and a determination to at least make a start, I descended the wooden stairs into the cool dimness below. The basement smelled the way it always had, like concrete and old cardboard and that particular mustiness that comes with being underground. David's work jacket still hung on a hook by the stairs. I touched it as I passed, and for just a moment I could almost convince myself he'd just stepped out and would be back any minute. I started with the obvious things, the items I knew we'd never need again. Old paint cans that had probably dried up years ago. Broken lawn furniture we'd meant to repair. Boxes of electronics from the 80s that we'd kept out of some vague sense that they might be valuable someday. It felt good to be making decisions, to be taking action instead of sitting upstairs in the house that felt too quiet without him. It was behind his old fishing gear, tucked into a corner I rarely paid attention to, that I found the box. It wasn't anything special, just a plain cardboard banker's box, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. But something about it caught my attention. It was newer than most things down here, the cardboard still crisp and clean, and it had been pushed back deliberately, hidden behind other items in a way that suggested intentionality. I pulled it out and set it on the concrete floor. The box was taped shut, and across the top, in David's precise handwriting, was a single word, private. Not labeled with contents like the other boxes down here, just that one word that seemed designed to warn people away. My first instinct was to respect that label, to assume it contained tax returns or old work documents, something boring and administrative that he'd marked private simply because it contained sensitive information. I almost pushed it back where I'd found it. But something made me hesitate. David was gone. There was no privacy left to protect, was there? And if there were important documents in here, I needed to know about them. I used my house key to cut through the tape. The sound seemed loud in the quiet basement, like I was breaking a seal on something that should have stayed closed. Inside, the box was filled with envelopes, dozens of them, maybe more than 100, all addressed to David at our home address. They were organized by year, rubber-banded into bundles, dating back more than 30 years. I picked up the top bundle, from the most recent years. The return addresses were all the same, from someone named Michael Chen in San Francisco. I didn't recognize the name. David and I had lived in Ohio our entire married life, and I couldn't remember him ever mentioning anyone named Michael in California. I opened the first letter, telling myself I was just checking to see if it was something important. The paper inside was covered in neat handwriting, and it began with, "My dearest David." Not "Dear David" or "Hi David," but "My dearest." The tone immediately felt intimate in a way that made my stomach tighten. I read the first few lines. The letter talked about a recent phone call they'd apparently had, about Michael's work at some tech company, about the weather in San Francisco. Normal, friendly conversation. But there was something about the language, the casual intimacy of it, that felt off. I flipped to the end of the letter, looking for a signature, some clue about who this Michael person was. The letter closed with, "All my love," As always, M. I sat down on an old lawn chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. All my love. As always. I opened another letter, this one from 5 years earlier. It was longer, more detailed, talking about a trip Michael had taken to Seattle, about a difficult project at work, about missing David and wishing they could see each other more often. It ended the same way. All my love, as always, M. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I was looking at. An old friend? But why would David hide letters from an old friend? And that closing, that intimate language, didn't feel like friendship. At least, not the kind of friendship I was familiar with. I opened more letters, working backward through time. They were all similar in tone, chronicles of Michael's life mixed with references to phone calls with David, occasional mentions of brief visits they'd apparently managed to arrange over the years. The letters from the 80s, the oldest ones in the box, were different in quality. The handwriting was the same, but younger, more exuberant. These letters talked about shared memories, about missing someone who was clearly more than just a friend. One letter, dated December 1982, stopped me cold. I know you made your choice, it read, and I respect it. I know you need to build the life you've planned, the life your family expects from you. But David, please don't forget what we had. Please don't forget that it was real, that we were real. I'll be here, waiting, hoping that maybe someday things will be different. Until then, I'll treasure every letter, every phone call, every stolen moment we managed to find. I read that paragraph 3 times, each time feeling like I was falling, like the ground beneath me was giving way. The implications were clear, unavoidable. David had been in a relationship with this man. Not just any relationship, but something serious enough that there had been a choice involved, a decision to walk away and build a different life. A life with me. I looked at the dates again. December 1982. David and I had started dating in January 1983. We'd met at a New Year's party, both of us 25 years old, both of us ready to settle down and start building futures. He'd seemed so confident, so certain about what he wanted. Within 6 months we were engaged, and by the following year we were married. I'd always thought of our courtship as romantic in its swiftness. 2 people who knew immediately that they'd found the right person. But now I was looking at it differently. Had David been running from something? Running from someone? Had I been the safe choice, the socially acceptable path, the way to build the life his family expected? I spent the next 3 hours in that basement, reading every single letter in chronological order. Together, they told a story I'd never known existed. David and Michael had met in college, roommates their freshman year who'd become much more than friends. They'd been together for 4 years, navigating their relationship in an era when being openly gay was far more difficult and dangerous than it is today. They'd talked about a future together, about moving to a city where they could be themselves, about building a life that was authentic even if it was hard. But then David's father had gotten sick. The letters from 1982 talked about David going home to help his family, about the pressure he was under to take over the family business, about conversations with his parents about settling down and giving them grandchildren. Michael's letters were supportive at first, encouraging, telling David to do what he needed to do for his family. But there was an undercurrent of anxiety in them, a growing fear that David was being pulled in a direction that didn't include Michael. And then there was the letter from December, the one where it became clear that David had made a decision. He was going to do what was expected of him. He was going to come back to Ohio, take over his father's hardware store, find a nice woman to marry, and build a conventional life. Michael's letter was heartbroken but understanding, loving but resigned. He promised to always be there for David, promised to accept whatever limited connection David could offer. And he'd kept that promise. For more than 30 years, Michael had written letters. Sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, but consistently, reliably, maintaining a connection to the man he'd loved since college. The letters chronicled his life, his career success in Silicon Valley, relationships he tried to build with other people that never quite worked out, his eventual acceptance of a life lived largely alone because the person he loved was unavailable. But they also chronicled brief encounters with David. References to phone calls, always late at night when I would have been asleep. Mentions of business trips David had taken over the years, times when he'd claimed to be visiting suppliers or attending trade shows, but had apparently been meeting Michael instead. The most recent letters, from the last few years before David got sick, talked about these visits with a bittersweet quality, both men knowing they were getting older, knowing their time was limited. I found photographs tucked into some of the letters. David and Michael in college, young and carefree in a way I'd never seen David look. David in his 30s, standing in what looked like San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. David in his 50s, older but still recognizable, his arm around Michael in a casual, intimate way that made my breath catch. These photos showed a version of my husband I'd never known, a David who smiled differently, who held himself differently, who looked genuinely, completely happy. The last letter in the box was dated just 2 months before David's diagnosis. Michael wrote about being grateful for a recent visit, about how precious their time together had become, about hoping they'd have many more years to continue their quiet, hidden connection. "I know this isn't the life either of us would have chosen," he wrote, "but I'm grateful for whatever pieces of you I can have. Loving you has been the defining fact of my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, even if it means loving you from a distance." I sat in that basement until the afternoon light began to fade, surrounded by letters that rewrote my entire understanding of my marriage. Everything I thought I knew felt uncertain now. Had David loved me? Or had I been a convenient cover, a way to build the life he thought he was supposed to want? Had our entire marriage been a lie? But even as these questions tore through me, I kept coming back to memories that contradicted that simple narrative. David had been a good husband. He'd been kind, attentive, affectionate in his quiet way. He'd been an involved father to our 2 children, present for every school event and soccer game and bedtime story. He'd held my hand through my mother's death, through 2 miscarriages before we finally had our kids, through all the ordinary struggles and celebrations of a long marriage. That hadn't been fake, had it? I thought about the last months of his life, about how he'd faced his illness with a stoic determination not to burden us with his fear. I thought about our last conversation, the night before he died, when he'd held my hand and thanked me for giving him a good life. I'd thought at the time that he was talking about our family, our home, the decades we'd spent together. But now I wondered if there had been layers to that statement I hadn't understood, gratitude mixed with regret, appreciation for what we'd built alongside sorrow for what he'd given up. I finally went upstairs as the sun was setting, leaving the letters spread out on the basement floor. I couldn't bear to pack them back up, but I also couldn't bring myself to throw them away. They were evidence of something, though I wasn't sure what. A betrayal? A sacrifice? A compromise that had allowed David to live the life expected of him while maintaining some small connection to who he really was? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in our bed, the bed we'd shared for 23 years, and I tried to reconcile the David I thought I'd known with this other David, the one who'd lived a double life, who'd maintained a relationship spanning decades with someone I'd never even known existed. I felt betrayed, certainly. But I also felt something more complicated, a sadness for David, for the parts of himself he'd felt he needed to hide, for the impossible choice he'd made when he was 25 years old. The next morning, I found Michael's most recent return address on one of the letters. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and composed an email. I didn't know if the address was still current, didn't know if he'd want to hear from me, but I felt compelled to reach out. "Dear Michael," I wrote. "My name is Jennifer, and I was David's wife. I'm sorry to tell you that David passed away 6 months ago. I've recently discovered your letters, and I wanted you to know that he kept every single one. I have many questions, and I imagine you might have some for me as well. If you're willing, I'd like to talk." I sent it before I could second-guess myself. Then I waited, unsure what I was hoping for. Answers, maybe. Understanding. Some way to make sense of the revelation that had turned my understanding of my marriage inside out. Michael responded within hours. His email was careful, measured, clearly written by someone trying to navigate a minefield of potential hurt and misunderstanding. He expressed his condolences for my loss, acknowledged the awkwardness and pain of the situation, and offered to talk if I thought it would be helpful. He ended by saying that David had loved our family very much, that he talked about us often, and that Michael had always understood that David's life with us was real and important, not a facade or a lie. We arranged a phone call for that evening. I spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, running through all the questions I wanted to ask, preparing myself for answers that might hurt. When the phone rang at the appointed time, I almost didn't answer. But I picked up on the fourth ring, and heard a voice that was warm and careful and deeply sad. We talked for nearly 3 hours that first conversation. Michael told me about meeting David in college, about falling in love with someone who was brilliant and kind and terrified of disappointing his family. He told me about the years they'd been together, about plans they'd made, about the future they'd imagined. And then he told me about watching David struggle with the weight of expectations, about seeing him torn between living authentically and living the life his family and society demanded. "He didn't choose you because he didn't love me," Michael said quietly. "He chose the life he thought he was supposed to live. And I think in many ways he made peace with that choice. He loved you, Jennifer. He loved your children. He built something real with you, even if it wasn't the only truth of who he was." I asked him about the visits, the phone calls, the decades of maintained connection. Michael was honest about it, almost painfully so. Yes, they'd continued to see each other occasionally over the years. But it wasn't an affair in the traditional sense, he explained. It was more like maintaining a connection to a part of himself that David had otherwise shut away. They'd talk, share meals, sometimes just sit together in comfortable silence, two people who'd loved each other for decades finding brief moments to exist as their true selves. "Did he regret it?" I asked. "Did he regret marrying me, having our family, the life we built?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I think he held both truths simultaneously," he finally said. "He loved his life with you. He was proud of his children, grateful for the stability and normalcy he'd built. But yes, there was also regret for the path not taken, sadness for the life we might have had together. People are complicated, Jennifer. David was complicated. He contained multitudes, contradictions, compromises. I think he did the best he could with an impossible situation." Over the following weeks, Michael and I continued to talk. Slowly, carefully, we built a strange kind of friendship founded on our shared connection to David, our shared grief for a man we'd both loved in different ways. Michael sent me more photographs, stories from the years before I'd known David, filling in gaps in a history I was realizing I'd only partially understood. I learned that David had been an art student in college, passionate about painting, before he'd set it all aside to take over his father's hardware store. Michael sent me pictures of David's work from those years, abstract pieces full of color and emotion that bore no resemblance to the practical, organized man I'd known. I learned that David had loved hiking and camping, spending long weekends in the mountains with Michael, before he'd settled into a life of suburban routine and weekend home improvement projects. I was seeing layers of my husband I'd never known existed, versions of him he'd left behind when he'd chosen the path that led to me. And with that understanding came a complicated grief, mourning not just the man I'd lost but the parts of him that had been lost long before I'd even met him. I told our children about the letters 3 months after finding them. They were adults now, in their late 20s, and I felt they had a right to know the full truth about their father. The conversation was difficult, filled with questions I couldn't fully answer and hurt I couldn't completely alleviate. But in the end, they responded with a maturity and compassion that made me proud. My daughter Emma was angry at first, feeling that her entire understanding of her father had been built on a lie. But as we talked it through, as I shared some of Michael's stories and showed her the photographs of young David, her anger softened into sadness. "He must have felt so alone," she finally said, tears running down her face. "Living his whole life unable to be fully himself, always hiding a part of who he was." My son Jake was quieter, more thoughtful in his processing. He asked careful questions about the timeline, about how long the connection with Michael had lasted, about what it must have been like for David to navigate such an impossible situation. "I wish he'd felt like he could tell us," he said. "I wish he'd known we would have understood, that we would have loved him anyway." At Jake's suggestion, we invited Michael to visit. He flew to Ohio 6 months after my initial email, nervous and uncertain about meeting the family David had built. That first meeting was awkward, all of us trying to navigate emotions we didn't quite have names for. But over the course of the weekend, something shifted. Michael told us stories about young David, showed us more photographs, helped us understand the man our husband and father had been before life's compromises had shaped him into the person we'd known. On Michael's last evening with us, we all went through the letters together. Michael read some of them aloud, adding context and memory to words written decades earlier. We laughed at funny stories, cried over poignant moments, and gradually built a more complete picture of David's life. It was painful and healing simultaneously, a process of grief and understanding woven together. He talked about you all constantly, Michael told us. Emma, he was so proud when you graduated law school. Jake, he bragged about your music to anyone who would listen. Jennifer, he loved you. Maybe not in the way you thought, maybe not without complications, but it was real. Please don't doubt that. After Michael left, our family began the slow process of integrating this new understanding of David into our memories and our grief. It wasn't easy. There were conversations that circled back on themselves, questions that had no satisfying answers, moments of anger and hurt that we had to work through. But there was also, surprisingly, a sense of relief. The David we were constructing from these revealed pieces felt more real somehow, more human in his contradictions and compromises than the somewhat distant figure we'd known. I went through our house and gathered every photograph I had of David. Then I created an album, mixing images from his life with me alongside the photographs Michael had shared from his earlier years. The juxtaposition was striking. You could see the evolution of a man learning to live within constraints he'd chosen but that nonetheless confined him. But you could also see, in his eyes when he looked at our children, in his smile at our wedding, in candid moments I'd captured over the years, genuine happiness and love. Michael and I have maintained regular contact. We video chat monthly, sharing memories of David, helping each other through the ongoing process of grief. He's become an unexpected friend, a connection to a part of my husband's life that I'll never fully understand but have learned to accept. He's planning to visit again next year, and Emma has already asked if he'll come to her wedding. He's family now, in a way I never could have predicted, bound to us by our shared love for a complicated man. I've thought a lot about what it means that David kept those letters, that he hid them but didn't destroy them. I think part of him wanted them to be found eventually, wanted us to know the full truth of who he was, even if he couldn't bring himself to tell us while he was alive. The letters were his way of documenting a part of himself he couldn't express openly, ensuring that at least somewhere, in written form, the complete story existed. I've also thought about his choice, made when he was 25 years old, to live a conventional life rather than an authentic one. It's easy, from the perspective of 2024, to judge that choice harshly. But David came of age in the 1970s in a small Ohio town where being gay wasn't just stigmatized, it was dangerous. He faced pressure from family, from society, from the entire structure of the world he knew. The courage it would have taken to choose differently, to build a life with Michael despite all those forces pushing against them, would have been enormous. So instead of judging, I've tried to understand. David made the choice he thought he had to make, and then he lived within that choice as honestly as he could. He was a good father, a reliable husband, a productive member of our community. But he also maintained a thread of connection to who he really was, a lifeline to his authentic self that he couldn't sever completely. And somehow, impossibly, he managed to hold both of these realities simultaneously for more than 30 years. Do I wish he'd told me? Yes, desperately. I wish he'd trusted me enough to share this part of himself. I wish we could have had an honest conversation about what his life with Michael meant, about how we could navigate his needs alongside our marriage. I wish, most of all, that he hadn't felt he needed to carry this secret alone for his entire adult life. But I also understand why he didn't tell me. In many ways, telling me would have forced us both to confront contradictions and complications we might not have been able to resolve. It would have required me to accept a version of our marriage that deviated from what I thought I'd signed up for. It would have forced us to navigate waters that neither of us had maps for, in an era when even discussing such things was difficult. Those letters revealed a life David never told me about, but they also revealed something else. They showed me a man trying his best to honor multiple truths simultaneously, to be who his family needed him to be while maintaining some small connection to who he really was. It wasn't a perfect solution. It involved deception and secrets and a lifelong inner conflict I can only begin to imagine. But it was his solution, his way of navigating an impossible situation with as much integrity as he could manage. I still keep the box of letters in the basement, though I've read through them all multiple times now. Sometimes, when I'm missing David particularly badly, I'll go down there and read a few at random. They help me feel connected to him, to the full complicated reality of who he was rather than the simplified version I'd constructed during our marriage. And in a strange way, knowing the complete story has actually helped with my grief. I'm mourning a real person now, flaws and contradictions and hidden depths included, rather than an idealized memory. The discovery of those letters didn't destroy my marriage or my memories. It complicated them, certainly. It added layers of nuance and sadness and understanding that I hadn't expected. But it also gave me the gift of knowing my husband more fully, of understanding the weight he carried and the choices he made. And it connected me to Michael, who has become an unexpected source of comfort and friendship, someone who loved David as deeply as I did, just differently. Our family has made peace with this revelation in our own ways. Emma has started asking Michael about David's art, and has even framed one of his college paintings for her apartment. Jake has written songs about family secrets and the courage it takes to live authentically, working through his own feelings about his father's hidden life through his music. And I've learned that love can be complicated without being false, that people can contain contradictions without being hypocrites, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is accepting someone fully, even the parts of them you discover too late. David's hidden life doesn't diminish the life we built together. It exists alongside it, parallel and intersecting, two truths that somehow both manage to be real. He loved Michael, and he loved our family. He lived the life he thought he was supposed to live, and he maintained a connection to the life he wanted. He made impossible compromises and did his best to honor all the people who depended on him, even when those obligations pulled him in contradictory directions. I found letters my husband hid, and they revealed a life he never told me about. But they also revealed a man more complex, more human, and more deserving of compassion than I'd realized. And in the end, that knowledge, painful as it was to acquire, has been a gift. Because now I know the whole story. Now I understand not just who David was to me, but who he was to himself. And that understanding, difficult as it was to reach, has given me a kind of peace I didn't know I needed.